China was kind of scoffed off as an imitator rather than a real innovator. And 10 years later, it's become kind of at the very frontier of cutting-edge technology. And we usually think about the Chinese model or the Chinese system as being extremely centralized, as if everything is made at the very top. That's not quite the case. It is more precisely defined as political centralization and an extreme form of economic decentralization. If you ask the Chinese to choose between freedom and security, something like 95% would choose security over freedom. If you ask the same question to an American person, 27% of them chose security over freedom.
Now, have you ever questioned whether China's economy has peaked or is on the verge of collapse? In this video, Professor Keyu Jin provides an in-depth explanation of how China's economy truly functions and why a collapse isn't happening anytime soon.
Let me start with a few facts, just to put things into perspective. Now, China, in all of human history, was the country that grew the fastest for the longest period of time. And that is no small feat, given that it is such a large country with so many people. Second, 4 out of 5 of the most downloaded apps in the US today are actually Chinese. Now, there are 2 levels of irony here. One is, of course, the obvious one, which is the geopolitical tension between the 2 countries. And the second is that only 10 years ago, China was kind of scoffed off as an imitator rather than a real innovator. And 10 years later, it's become kind of at the very frontier of cutting-edge technology. Now, when I was growing up in China, China was still an economic backwater. I remember that China used to trade 1 billion shirts for 1 airplane, and now China makes its own personal passenger jet. It's also one of the most connected components in the world. China's manufacturing capacity is 3 times that of the US, 6 times that of Japan, 9 times that of Germany. And whether it's air conditioners, solar modules, or lithium batteries, China's market share in the world is over 75%. And 15 years ago, China couldn't make its own combustion engine vehicle, way behind. Now it is the absolute leader in EVs, accounting for more than 65% of global production. Now, of course, it's not immune to economic downturns, as we're seeing right now. In the last decade, over this decade, its growth has fallen from 10.5% on average in the previous decade to only 6.2% in this current decade. More startling, in 2018, there were 50,000 new companies in that year. In this year, that number is 1,200, from 50,000 to 1,200, and that number is still declining. FDI into China is only 1/7 of what it was prior to the pandemic. China's debt to GDP ratio is something like 280%, as indebted as Japan and the US. But to put that into perspective, the US probably had a dozen economic cycles in the last 100 years. This is China's first economic downturn in 40 years. So we get China more often wrong than we get it right. And this is part of what my book is about, to offer a different kind of perspective, to say that things are not just black and white. There is more than one way of making things work. And there are important elements like culture and history that play a very, very important role in shaping the Chinese economy. Even taking the role of the state, for instance, we tend to just see it as getting in the way of markets, the state being this heavy, old dinosaur-like kind of imposition to the private economy. But it's more subtle than that. In China, without state mobilization, state coordination, it would have been absolutely impossible that China built its largest EV sector within 10 years. It definitely involved the state rolling out 4 million EV charging stations, as opposed to 160,000 in the US. It involved the state coordinating supply chains, building factories, helping companies attract talent, and doing everything they can. Actually, ironically, the Shanghainese government subsidized Tesla. Tesla was on the brink of bankruptcy. The Shanghainese government gave it money, gave it cash, gave it land, ramped up its production, which otherwise wouldn't have happened, and Tesla was on the way to becoming what it was today. So when we're talking about, around the world today, we're talking a lot about these new sectors like AI, like renewables, solar, and all of this. And if you go around the countries, what do they mention? They mention state capacity. State capacity is now is still a very important word. And if we look at the canonical models that we study, there's very little room for the state. Now, of course, as we'll discuss in this talk, there's a bad and the good, and it's a mixed picture. It's a subtle picture, but we simply cannot dismiss one thing as right or wrong. Now, when it comes to culture, economists tend to not, let's say, cast that as a really important factor in shaping the economy. But in the case of China, I think it does explain a lot of the quixotic elements of the Chinese economy. Now, for one thing, let's take the fact that somebody who lives in Beijing, who's earning on average 1/5 of the income of someone who's in San Francisco, can afford a house or a flat, an apartment at the same prices. How does that actually happen? One cultural phenomenon is that we say that there are actually 6 wallets behind a young person. Potentially, the 2 wallets being the spouses, but then their parents of each respective person, and maybe even the grandparents would chip in. Or take another, the relationship with authority. Our relationship with authority is not black and white, it's gray. If you think about the tiger mother phenomenon, I don't think it's that different from how the relationship between the people and the state is. The state being paternalistic, that urge to control, that desire for stability, definitely shapes Chinese policies. Now, sometimes it creates the opposite effect of what its intentions are. For instance, in the financial system, the urge to protect retail investors and to stabilize the market actually sometimes create more instability and more calamitous results in the stock market. So many of these aspects relate to China's culture, relates to its history. Or take the more contemporary version of the influencer economy in China. That's worth $500 million. That's half of the US's restaurant business. And I tell this to my friends, and they just find it absolutely wild why lots of Chinese people would pay huge sums to support the influencers they like, but whom they will never meet, never be in direct contact, and never have any kind of relationship except spend huge sums just supporting this virtuous, kind of virtual fan. And that's a big business in China. So in that sense, I think to understand China in those lenses can help us use a framework to see why it makes some choices, why it has certain implications, and how to see the future. So let me jump in to an example. And by the way, this is another misunderstanding, which is that despite being the fastest growing economy over the last 40 years, there have been a few versions of the China collapse story. 1980s, 1998, the coming collapse of China. Gordon Chang had 2 versions of China collapse story, 2001, 2015, and then of course now the latest version is peak China theory. Now, there are elements of truth. There have been huge tumultuous events happening in all these times, but every time the state had been able to manage it, manage through it, learn from the past, and go on. The question today is the 2020s, this peak China theory, is it real? Is it a reality? Is this a permanent decline in the economy, which I'm sure we will get to in our conversation with Hélène. Now, let me jump into what I think is one of the things that are most misunderstood, which is actually how the model works, right? It's a political economy model because the state plays a very important role. And we usually think about the Chinese model or the Chinese system as being extremely centralized, as if everything is made at the very top. And that's not quite the case. It is more precisely defined as political centralization and an extreme form of economic decentralization. This case study will give you a snippet as to why. So this is 2005. This is solar. This is the patent distribution at the city level in China. And you can see it's pretty much a desert. This is a heat map where red represents, the top red means that there's a particular city has between 1,000 to 2,500 new patents, solar patents per year. This is 2005. And at this point, the Chinese government decided to pursue an industrial policy around solar. Okay? Same thing with robotics, same thing with EVs, the same story. But it was rolled out in different cities over different periods of time. And it was up to the city level government, local government, to decide how much to do, what to do, and how to do it. All of this are very, very important details, right? So the center sets the direction, but really pretty much everything is implemented at the local level. So that's 2005, and of course we knew that there was a solar boom after. Now, this is 2019. Even by 2015, 2016, this map would look very similar. You can see that, first of all, this is solar patent, so solar innovations. Same thing with production. It's spread over lots of different cities, right? It's not concentrated just in Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, a few cities, but all over China. And what's more, the ones around with the black lining are the cities that had pursued this industrial policy, and they tended to have more solar patent innovation achievement. So you can see that there are quite a few cities, not again just in Beijing, Shanghai, but really pretty well spread out, that has achieved between 1,000 to 2,500 new solar patents per year. And you can identify the causal effect of some of these industrial policies implemented on the impact. And I think this is a pretty convincing map. If you look at EVs, it's the same thing. It was first started with maybe a few cities, and then 13 cities, and they were rolled out to 80 cities. And over this period of time, China made huge strides in EVs, robotics, same picture. Right? So now with any model, there's of course benefits and costs. So in order to evaluate the rationale behind the model, you have to measure both, and we'll come back to the costs. But this is a very, very potent model when it comes to scaling up, when it comes to jump-starting new sectors, new emerging strategic sectors, which is China's focus right now, and a lot of it has to do with the local government model, which we call in China the mayor economy. It's not just the mayors, it's the party secretaries, but the local governments. Okay, so how does this work? So on the top, you have the central government. Now, what is really key is that central government has a particular power, which is not true in the case of many other centralized governments, which is that they hold the keys to the promotion and the personnel of the local governments, the provincial governors, the mayors, and so forth. The local government is usually measured against some objectives. Now, in the most part of the last 40 years, it was just GDP growth. And the benefit of that was it was transparent. Sorry, it was quantifiable. It was singular. Everybody manipulated GDP, but somehow there was a contest, right? But you didn't have the other stuff. So it was GDP growth. Every provincial governor would be like, what's the next guy next door to me doing in terms of GDP growth? And there's a lot of kind of competition. This is the really important thing, is that, first of all, the central government measures local government officials' success by looking at their GDP growth. But then they instill in these government officials a huge tournament, and they compete with each other. That mechanism, even though it's not a democracy, even though it's not, the rule of law was very poor over this period of time, that created a lot of the incentives for the local governments to, on the most part, to do good for the local economy. There was a lot of competition, and it did create a certain level of checks and balances between them. I mean, if you think about it, if you're a local government, what would you do to your private companies? If you kill the golden goose that lays the egg, right, then you're done for. You're not going to be promoted. You're not going to have that GDP growth. And by the way, they're just simply going to flock away. The point about being China is that it's big. There's regional mobility. They will flock away. So contrary to what we think about the Chinese government as being quite, suppressing the private sector and so forth, of course, elements of that are true. On the most part, the local government wanted to select the best, most productive private firms. And not just one or two, but many, 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 thousands of them. So this is, and then they become promoted. Now, it's, of course, not just only based on GDP or economic performance, but for a long period of time, the economy was very, very important. Now, that model is the model with which the Chinese government did industrialization. So think about all the steel factories and all that, because the focus was on industrialization in the 1990s, all the way until the 2000s, early 2000s, because the Chinese government thought industrialization is like modernization. But then the second trend is urbanization. Why did the local government suddenly want to do urbanization? This relates to the real estate, because it was an even faster way of achieving their targets: growth, employment, investment. Rather than building steel factories, they started to roll out property en masse with not enough people to live in it. Now, the ghost town story is somewhat true, but actually it was really a phenomenon where they would build out these properties in big cities and nobody would be there. And then over time, they create employment and then people will move in. So lots of the ghost town stories that were featured in the New York Times, eventually they became above 75% occupancy rate and so forth. But it was a local government phenomenon. And today, fast forward, it's no longer about the real estate for a variety of reasons, short-term macro policy. It's now about innovation, solar panels, EVs. Again, the same model. The same level of resources, same political economy, centralized government, but decentralized local economy model to foster that. And this was a very powerful model to scale up, to do these big things. But as we'll see, it's a very weak model to do things like raising personal consumption or having the agility and resilience to adapt. So the mayor economy makes sense, right? Why do the local governments want to do good? What is their incentive? Well, first of all, we said that they want to be promoted politically. But then if you think about it, if they help the good private sectors, what do they get? They build an industrial clutter. Many companies start to move in, lots of jobs, lots of tax revenues, fiscal revenues, which is really important for them. The land of their local jurisdiction is suddenly worth much more. They collect more fiscal resources. They are actually an equity stakeholder of the entire economy. So when there are a lot of and people here are in the business world, sometimes they wonder why the local governments would actually put up capital to invest, be equity stakeholders of these startups. it's not just for the returns, right? It is for this whole pie that they want to grow. So as you can see, the point about this is that their incentives are totally aligned with private companies on the most part. Now, of course, you're going to get these very corrupt officials and get lots of stories, but again, this is the model that by and large actually spurred China forward, and that's the local economy. I don't have much time, so I would end by talking about one more theme, which is coming back to the cultural elements. The cultural elements, as we said, for instance, our relationship to authority. I think one stat which is really interesting is from the World Values Survey. If you ask the Chinese to choose between freedom and security, something like 95% would choose security over freedom. If you ask the same question to an American person, 27% of them chose security over freedom. Now, there are lots of issues with these kind of surveys, but it just goes to show that the gap is quite significant. Now, I bring up in the cultural element the generational aspect. This is getting a little bit further from economics, but I still do believe that they will shape many aspects of the economy, which is that these generations, because of China's big change in history in the last few decades, will produce very likely very different economic results as well. Post-60s, my parents' generation, born in the 1940s, 50s, went through the Cultural Revolution, went through the really significant Chinese vicissitudes of hardship, psychological, economic, and all of that. They think very differently from the post-80s, my generation, one-child policy. Okay, that generation is called a buy a house generation because apparently for my generation there's only one objective, only one goal to reach, is to be able to afford a property in China, and hence we have many wallets behind our back. Post-1990s, again, very different. They're politically active. They're not as materialistic, or they're not so driven by so hungry like the post-70s Jack Ma, entrepreneur, ambitious kind of generation. Post-90s, they're politically active. They want to be involved, and they love to consume. I'll show you some data. They like lifestyle. They're self-confident. They're actually very proud of China. That's a very different generation from those born in the 1960s, 1970s, when China was still a very eager learner in the world economy, very kind of seeing what it can accomplish, very humble still at that point. Post-2000s, actually also politically different. Some of them called little pinks. Now, I don't know if this is the right way to go, but they are very, very confident about China's economy, China's innovation. Now, we might want to review the surveys after the recent round of economic downturns, but just to show you that very risk-averse, high savers of my parents' generation compared to the consumption generation. So for instance, compared to post-80s, comparing to before the 1980s, despite earning much less than the previous generation, they spend 22% higher per capita expenditure. Okay, they spend more, 60% higher on clothing per capita, 19% more on food, and contributes to 65% of growth in consumption. They account for people who are aged 35 and under account for 85% of consumer borrowing. Their average debt is 2.5 times more than their older generations. They're also socially conscious and open, right? This is where I think there's a lot of positive aspects of the new generation, where it's all about values now, right? The previous generation was all about being hungry. The Foxconn workers that were opting for 3 shifts per night. Now the new generation is about, values, social equity, the environment, and that obviously connects much better with the rest of the world, unlike the previous generation that was flooding apparently European American markets with their stuff, the stuff that they were producing day and night. It's also a golden era for women, at least from these statistics, because of the one-child policy. Every girl was educated in the same way as every son, which was not the case before the one-child policy, because sons got educated first. So you can see some of this in the numbers, whereas 15% of those born in the 1960s showed female leadership. This is, I think, data from public companies. 34% for those in the 1980s, and 42% for those in the 1990s. So it definitely gave an opportunity for women. Okay, I'm going to skip that. And lastly, I just want to say that to put everything into perspective, even despite the recent downturn, there's still a lot of potential. Right? There's 900 million people living under $300 a month, apparently. 176 million migrant workers who, from some estimates, with proper social protection, can unleash at least 1 trillion RMB of additional consumption every year. They spend only a third of what an equivalent urban worker with the same earning do right now. Only a third, because of the lack of social protection. Service sector, 47% of total employment and 50% of GDP. These numbers should be around at 80% in advanced economies. And TFP, depending on how you measure it, 20 to 40% of US levels. Now, if we look at countries that have leveled off their growth, whether it's Japan, South Korea, Singapore, et cetera, they have reached already 70 to 85% of US TFP levels at that time. So a lot of potential to grow. The question, as I'm sure we'll engage in the questions, is what does it take? What does it take for China to keep on growing, or is it really peak China now? So let me end with going towards the future. The future, or how we can explain about some of the change in the last few years, is about shifting objectives. The objective function has changed. As I told you, for a long period of time, the singular objective was GDP growth. That is no longer, and that has been no longer the case, has no longer been the case in the last 10 years. You have a mix of political loyalty, you have a mix of social issues, the environment, which is of course welcome, national security. You mix that bag into the objective function, and there are trade-offs. And it's much more difficult for local governments to, or they can have very conflicting conflicts, or maybe a lack of incentive to do certain more push for certain economic objectives. So the objective function has changed, as well as the development from industries to tech and innovation, which is, again, the biggest theme in China right now. It's all about pursuing high-tech innovation at all cost. And so this leads me to think about, in conclusion, to say that it's almost like an Olympic gold medal model that China pursues. There's a lot of similarities between the national pursuit to maximize its potential for Olympic gold medals as there is in its development model. Huge national resources, a whole of a nation program that links, all parties, from governments to private sector to the universities to athletes and all of that. Huge amount of personal sacrifice, okay? And in the end, also a huge amount of national motivation and exuberance. That is the Olympic model for China, and there are a lot of similarities with the developmental model. In that sense, as we look towards the future, is this really a replicable model in other places? Probably not. But I still believe that there are lessons of wisdom from the China element, even though we can debate about some of this. There are distillations of its mistake, and as we see from the indebtedness, very much tied to the local government model, the obviously environmental toll and all of that. This is all kind of the two sides of the same coin. So finally, I hope that this offers a little bit snippet of a different kind of framework from a different perspective to help you understand China from the inside, potentially. And I hope that that would be of interest as people are open-minded to learning about this big country, second most important economy. And I would almost say that not understanding it or misunderstanding it going forward in this context of geopolitical uncertainties would be a very dangerous thing to do. So thank you very much.